At the beginning of mixed martial arts, when the fights were just fights and there were a minimum of strategies and game plans, there was one fighter who stood out especially on this background, and his name was Bob Schrijber, the Terrible Bob. But he was terrible not because he had 17 defeats out of 38 fights, but because almost every fight he turned into a bloodbath and a real mess, which today we will remember in details. Schrijber began his fighting career in the distant 80s, and in his youth tried everything from alcohol and drugs to karate and judo, but really got high by kickboxing and Muay Thai, thanks to which he gave up other unhealthy addictions. Bob became the Dutch champion and European champion in Muay Thai and was a striker to the bones, who sometimes had panic attacks when he was transferred to the ground. 1995, Bob's debut in Ultimate Fighting. His rival is Ed Cruyff, also a fighter from Holland representing karate and judo. This fight was Bob's first fiasco at the big arena. Ed took Schrijber down and after tormenting him for about 4 minutes made him tap, pressing the Adam's apple with his forearm. That's how ingloriously Bob flew off at the very first stage, but as it turned out, he came to the tournament without a fight, but with 2 lives, because the karate fighter flew off due to injury and Schrijber went further down the grid. At the second stage, he got Rudy the Loss, who also had some idea of wrestling, which means that by default he was a big threat to Schrijber. Bob decided to make Rudy forget his skills, but didn't manage to knock out the opponent a little, and then as expected flew to the canvas. There were attempts from Bob to fight for the position, but they were very quickly neutralized, and he surrendered for the second time in the evening after the bulldog choke. Bob took up wrestling, and in fights where he didn't have to fight with wrestlers, he did something. Otherwise, the ground remained a problem for Schrijber that followed him like a dead weight throughout his career. Although Bob still has one victory by submission, this lucky one was the Bulgarian Emil Krastev, whom Schrijber choked with a guillotine in 1996. The funniest thing is that Emil went to the fight in boxing gloves, despite the fact that wrestling by the rules, as far as I understood, wasn't excluded. So for a complete setup, Emil still lacked fins. 1999, a tournament of 8 in Vale Tudo, and Bob gets into it with a duel with wrestler George Sorsa, for whom it was the 4th fight in his career and he had a record of 2-1. And judging by the way they met Schrijber in the hall, they knew something about him and wanted to see this Dutch butcher live. Josh brought Schrijber down with big problems, but he couldn't keep him there, and it was even a bigger mistake than going out to this fight at all. Josh was hit by blows from different angles, and then Bob fed him so satisfyingly with his elbows to the back of the head that he decided to tap as fast as possible until he forgot his way home and what day of the week it was. Having run over the first opponent, Bob in the semi-finals got a luta-livre style fighter and a champion of the last Vale Tudo tournament, Alexandre Ferreiro. Confident takedown from the Brazilian and the transition to the mount. Bob tries to get to his feet and gives his opponent his back. Not the safest move in the case of Schrijber, but Bob decided to take a chance and fell under submission. Although, as we remember, Bob is a very sly guy and didn't go to these tournaments without second life. It happened this time as well. Ferreira flew off due to injury and Bob won by defeat and advanced to the finals of the tournament.
Surprise, motherfucker!
In the last fight of the evening, the most well-known fighter of the tournament, Heath Herring, was waiting for him, who just lost the final of the last tournament to Ferreira, but Bob easily passed the Brazilian, so his chances were not great. Heath immediately tried to take Bob down, but he had to flee. By the 3rd try, Bob ended up on the canvas and led Herring into a mount, who was larger than Schrijber, and it wasn't an easy task to throw this boar off. Bob just resigned himself and relaxed, which even Herring didn't like, who rammed the opponent from above. He indicated to the referee that Bob was passive and the fight was stopped, so Heath Herring from the 2nd time nevertheless became the champion of the Vale Tudo tournament. And Bob lost another fight on the ground while not even resisting too much. In 1997, Bob first came to fight to Russia, namely to St. Petersburg, and took part in the M1 Global Tournament. It was a 4-person tournament, and to win it was necessary to beat 2 opponents in one evening. First of all, Bob ran over Emil Stroka, smashing him on the ground already at the end of the first minute of the fight, and then in the final he had to fight with Ruslan Kursalan. Ruslan unexpectedly takes Bob down and rams him with punches, but Schrijber heroically gets to his feet and responds to his opponent with the same stuff. Kursalan again takes Bob to the ground, and this time everything looks even worse. It seems that a little bit more and Ruslan will finish off the Dutch, but Schrijber gets up thanks to character and turns on his animal instincts to the maximum. The hat is used, with which Schrijber, instead of thinking, begins to beat Ruslan. Then he adds knees and a control kick to the head on an already falling opponent. Such a final cut was arranged by Bob Schrijber in St. Petersburg, and as a result came out the winner and became the champion of the M1 Global Tournament. After the triumph, Bob left M1 for 4 years and returned only in 2001 to fight Martin Malhosian, whom Bob knocked out in Netherlands just a month ago, although unfortunately I didn't find this fight. Martin's plan to move Bob down immediately didn't work, since Schrijber defended himself well from takedowns and was the absolute master of the cage. Bob pinned Malhosian to the net and shot in multi-hit series, not forgetting to kick out a savory low. Martin also had his chance. He nevertheless transferred Bob to the ground and managed to take the back, but from this excellent position he couldn't finish Schrijber and soon paid for it. Bob got to his feet and made another combo, and at the end of the 8th minute Martin was stopped. Here, Schreiber's 3-match winning streak in M1 was over, since in 2003 he again performed there, but this time he was finished by Roman Zentov and personally put the belt on the newly made champion. One of the most brutal and tough confrontations of the late 90s was the trilogy of Bob Schrijber and Gilbert Yvel, who also had heartburn for the wrestling, but in addition to that also had big problems with discipline. Their first fight took place at Dutch Rings in 1998. According to the rules of the organization, it was forbidden to punch in the head with a fist, but judging by such an aggressive beginning, the fighters were going to send each other to the hospital anyway. It was a real rumble on a collision course, and here clearly no one was going to save energy and invent some clever strategies, so literally after a couple of minutes of such a swing, the fighters already noticeably lost their batteries. In the second round, Bob dug his own grave with his own hands when he transferred Yvel to the ground. Gilbert also didn't like this business, but his skills and abilities were quite enough to carry out the Achilles hold and force Bob to surrender. After such a sparkling battle, the things didn't even have time to calm down, and 2 months later the fighters crossed again, this time in some little-known Dutch promotion, while it was the final of Tournament of 4 and the winner became the champion. Bob this time started a little differently. He didn't fly headlong to chop, but from a distance began to dry Gilbert's leg, inserting low kicks simply by a conveyor. Bob folds Yvel with a hit with his right, and then, feeling the blood, goes into the open slaughter, while looking much better in it. Gilbert repeatedly missed Bob's right overhand, and with this blow at the end of the first round, Schrijber finished him off. So the score equalized and now became 1-1. The third fight was only a matter of time, but the outcome dragged on for 4 long years. In March 2002, at the tournament of the Dutch organization Te God Te Handel, an end was put to the confrontation. Bob started with where he finished the second fight, namely low kicks and sweeping right overhand, forcing Yvel to go for a takedown, but Schrijber defended well and took this episode by kicking Gilbert into the cockpit. After another failure attempt to take down, Gilbert decided that this was a dead business and pressed Bob into a corner, imposed an exchange.
Right straight. What a war! Knee to the head by Gilbert Yvel. Right hand by Schrijber.
A real collision course begins in which Bob seizes the initiative and knocks Gilbert down twice. The functionality sucks again, but this only makes it more interesting, since there are almost no protective actions. The fighters just stand opposite each other and strike as hard as possible. Gilbert found salvation in his knees, which Schrijber ate without chewing, and it was clear that he was already pretty well fed, and his face became similar for one large medium rare Dutch steak. Therefore, the referee had to intervene and stop the fight, and for fans of old-fashioned uncompromising slaughter from the 90s, this full bout is mandatory to watch. Bob fought a lot in Netherlands, and he especially liked the It's Showtime organization, which by its name simply forced Schrijber to arrange merry bloody evenings, although Bob couldn't otherwise. 1999 and Schrijber's duel with Danish kickboxer Jarl Venetia, who won the K1 tournament in Netherlands and beat the flying gentleman Remy Boniaski twice. Right overhand and Jarl is knocked out. Great work from Schrijber. October 1995, a duel between Bob and Marty Horenstein at the Amsterdam Absolute Championship in Netherlands. Schrijber came out on a weekly notice and, according to his stories, was in a very bad shape while he was supposed to fight some kind of fat fighter, but at the very last moment the opponent changed. This fight is notable for its unusual rules, and as I understand it, the winner is the one who finishes his opponent more than once within a certain time, or something like that. Marty starts in Schrijber's style, and after the clinch the fight goes to the ground, and Bob is on top. Horenstein gets to his feet and in exchange runs onto Schrijber's left, who starts ramming him without mercy. The referee considers that this is the finish, he intervenes and stops Bob, and the score becomes 1-0 in his favor. The fight resumes and Schrijber, after the exchange for the second time, drops Marty, but he escapes and takes Bob's back, followed by a chokehold and submission. So the finish score evens out and becomes 1-1. Horenstein felt a second wind and for about a minute bit Schrijber at the ropes, who seemed to have just decided to take a little rest at that time, and then exploded and once again dropped his opponent. The next fall of Horenstein was the last. Bob won the fight, although I honestly absolutely didn't understand what happened there and how it was all evaluated. Kind of like Marty complained about being hit in the balls, but then there was some confusion and Schrijber's hand was raised. So the fight is certainly interesting, but due to the specifics of the rules, it's absolutely incomprehensible. A year later, Bob beat Horenstein for the second time and admitted that he considered their first fight the most difficult in his career. As a result, he had a broken rib, and when he entered the locker room, he completely lost consciousness due to his injuries. No less insane brawl Bob realized with the Dutch Hightower Sammy Schultz, with whom they chopped to death on the same It's Showtime in 2000. And before the fight itself, a rather epic staredown with a stepladder turned out, since Schrijber was 30 centimeters shorter and could look into his eyes only in this cheating way.
Schrijber trying to come close. Don't forget that Schrijber might be like the huge Sam Schild, 125 kilograms. And there,
the fighters made a brutal exchange at the very first seconds, and Bob dropped Schultz with a left hook. But the rules of the organization did allow Schrijber to finish opponent, and the referee, counting down the knockdown, resumed the fight in a standing position. Further, Sammy seized the initiative and, constantly entering the clinch, destroyed and smashed Bob with his knees, forcing Schrijber to turn on his brain and fight back with everything possible.
25 kilogram heavy muscle. Sam Schild, and there he goes.
One of the knees went straight into the beard and Schrijber collapsed. But in order to stop Schrijber, you need to knock Schrijber out. So having recovered, Bob went on an uncompromising exchange after exchange until the very end of the round. It was pure 5 minutes of an open fight in which there wasn't even a hint of any kind of gameplay. And if there was one, it was only about simply chopping off your opponent. At the beginning of the second round, the fight was over. Schultz held the guillotine in a stance and Bob grabbed the ropes, which was the signal for the referee, who intervened and stopped the fight. 2 months after the massacre with Schultz, Bob signed up for a fight with the Machine Ian Freeman, who had been the ring announcer of M1 Global since 2009, and by the time of the fight with Schrijber, had a solid record of 10 wins and 1 defeat, and all his fights ended ahead of schedule. Freeman clearly studied Bob's weaknesses, since the first thing he did was move Schrijber down and twist Bob's heel. But then Ian got into the game for which Bob was born. He decided to exchange with him. And if on Bob this acted like doping, and with each missed blow he only became more dangerous, then Freeman paid for his recklessness with a cut and then with a knockdown. This fight was stopped by the doctors at the 2nd minute of the round because of this bump that turned out on Freeman's head. So Bob took another victory ahead of schedule, although not in such a bright way that he had always strived for. Now let's remember one of the brightest fights of Schrijber. This was a meeting with another swashbuckler from Suriname, Melvin Manhoef, which took place in the Too Hot to Handle organization in March 2003. Manhoef has just started his career. For him it was only the 6th fight, and so far he went unbeaten, while Bob has already gone through a whole bunch of wars and battles, shedding more than 1 bucket of blood. Melvin starts very sharply, punching Bob hard across the floors and then knocking him down with a series of punches. As soon as he gets to his feet, Manhoef breaks loose and begins to beat Bob with long-lasting streaks, to which Schrijber goes into a dull defense and simply blocks himself out trying to survive. Bob even starts to cheat and spits out the mouthguard, hoping for help from the referee, who stopped the fight and gave Schrijber precious seconds to catch his breath. The last hope for Bob was his favorite takedown. It was not for nothing that he merged 7 fights with submissions, but Manhoef blocked the first couple of passes, and only for the 3rd time wrestler Bob was able to move the opponent down. Schrijber managed to overtake Manhoef in this fight and, despite the beating most of the time, took the victory, while doing it ahead of schedule and even on the canvas. On this, the confrontation between Melvin and Bob wasn't over, and after 2 years they had a rematch, but we must admit that by that time Bob was already very far from his optimal shape, and he lost the fight by unanimous decision of the judges. In September 1999, Bob went to Pride and fought the Japanese Dalia Matsui, who was only in the beginning of his journey and didn't win a single out of 3 fights. The Japanese in this fight simply mockingly transferred Bob to the ground and went on various subs, including his favorite leg locks. So apparently Schrijber was so frustrated by how things go that he didn't find anything smarter than to chop Matsui on the slide during the forced stoppage of the battle. The Japanese responds to Bob with a double and then throws him overboard when attempting a takedown. Dayu gave free rein to his fantasies and went into gear. At first he tried to trample Bob with stomps and then completely lost control of himself and came to the secret technique of Kamaru Usman, pressing poor Schrijber to the ropes and making chops from his feet.
Grabbing the ropes, Schrijber going in out.
Bob could forgive Matsui for everything, but not for the trampled feet, since this stomp to the back of the head after the gong is really difficult to explain. Schrijber would have lost this fight anyway, but after this blow he now lost it by disqualification. The Japanese decided that since Bob doesn't like grappling and loves stomps, then let him jump out with another fucking maniac, Wanderlei Silva, and see what it's like to be in this pair of shoes. Wanderlei took the initiative from the first minutes and squeezed Bob from the tie clinch a little. Knowing Schreiber's weaknesses, Silva didn't reinvent the bicycle and took his opponent to the ground. Taking his back, Vandy enlightened Schrijber with punches and then carried out a chokehold and won the fight at the 3rd minute of the round. So Bob was so weak on the ground that even Wanderlei managed to submit him. Although he had a black belt, that one was the only victory by a submission in his career. As for Bob, he ended his career with a record of 2017, and he lost almost all the fights to rivals with names, but even in spite of this, he certainly stands out from all the other average fighters. But you really can't blame him for no charisma or ability to chop to death. He currently owns his own gym in Netherlands and trains MMA and Muay Thai fighters, and one of his most famous students is Stefan Struve. Like this video? Leave likes and don't upset Bob. Also, if he's not subscribed, subscribe and press the bell to stay in touch and not to miss the next reviews.